Hello and welcome to my brief presentation. My name is Vilmos Katana and I'm an architect, critic and architectural theorist. Today, I would like to talk about a topic that might be unusual from a purely economic or political point of view. This topic is fractal analysis, an emerging discipline in applied mathematics that is getting more often used for evaluating the built environment. That is to tell how attractive and harmonious our buildings and cities are. This may be then one of the keys for maintaining urban sustainability, effective monument protection, policy making, or strategic planning. What I'm going to emphasize here is a distinct role of architectural facades, which had been more important in the past than it is today in the functional or technological era, because buildings were predestined to be unique due to the lack of industrial reproduction. Architectural tectonics taught people how to build simply and logically because of limited resources, and how to communicate with the building's facades that were more than important as it contained cultural symbols and revealed the identity of communities. As early as the first triumphal arches of the ancient Roman Empire, the one being shown here is from 21 CE in Arausio, today's Orange in France. Facades were more valuable than previously thought. In this case, the arch is not merely functional but symbolic and decorative, because its side view is more like a temple. With this relief, Romans wanted to convey a political message that the portal to the empire, thus the Roman presence, is sacred. Contrary to the contemporary Greek urban development, Romans did not just erect individual monuments, but were the first ones to plan continuous urban facades where buildings were joined to frame closed public squares and fora. This gave the Roman architecture capable of ruling space, promoting symbols, and creating illusions of depth by the building's elevations. They unified the Greek form with their own imperial narrative and the Italian sense of place. In architecture, it was manifested in the orthogonal system of columns and cornices, united with the arcade, that is, the motif of the Colosseum. This motif was the essential pattern that signified Roman architecture, which survived in Europe long after the fall of the Western Empire. It was though reborn in Christian medieval architecture, where facades were once again appearing as the conveyors of religious, symbolic, and political narratives, as well as visual attractions. It seems that the secret behind this visual attraction is a certain set of tectonic patterns. Moreover, a disposition where facades traditionally appear as compositions of overlapping layers that generate an illusion of depth. Another way of reading traditional facades is by taking them as a collage of parallel fronts. Either way, facades are tectonic reliefs that preserve patterns of spatial and cultural narratives. This created a sense of normal visual environment, a decorative intensity and plasticity that people got used to during the millennia, which was well understood by the Renaissance masters, among whom the most well-known may be Andrea Palladio. You can see here the front of San Giorgio Maggiore from Venice, how clearly it is composed of layers. Tectonic composition also implies that facades are relatively autonomous parts of the edifices. And evidence for this can be found when looking at the fronts of Renaissance urban palaces such as Michelozzo Michelozzi's Palazzo Medici Riccardi or Leon Battista Alberti's Palazzo Rucellai in Florence. However, the tectonic logic, best described by the 19th century architect and theorist Gottfried Zemper, always requires a certain connection between the structure and the cladding, or, in other words, the frame and the membrane. The latter conveys, but also somewhat reveals, the former, as the pilasters signify the main vertical axis of physical forces, but are not mere structures. Another highly important feature of tectonic logic is that their layers contain details that have different scales. The smaller the detail, the thinner the layer, and the bigger the area, the more intense the plasticity. This is the mathematical rule for self-similar symmetries, or in other words, for fractal geometry. The rule can be easily tested by analyzing, for example, Andrea Palladio's Palazzo Valmarana in Vicenza. In 1987, Thomas Schumacher published an essay in the Cornell Journal of Architecture on the so-called Palladio variations, claiming that Palladio's facades can be divided into certain layers that overlap each other. He managed to sketch up the layers, which I modified a little bit to emphasize the scale differences of the details. In the left column, you can see details that are added to the plane, and in the right column, there are areas that are subtracted from it. The key is that because of these additions and subtractions, the facade is no longer two-dimensional. Moreover, as the layers change scale from the large structural grid to the ornaments on the parapet walls, more and more details appear, as if the facade was created with the same mathematical principles as the Romanesco broccoli, which is famous for its easily recognizable self-similarity. This pattern characterized our buildings until the late 19th century, even in the United States. You can see in the slide the Wainwright State Office building in St. Louis, Missouri, designed by the world-renowned Louis Sullivan and Dagmar Adler. If we scale up the pattern over the individual buildings, we are able to examine the plasticity of urban facades as well. We can also compare the historical cities with the modern ones, assuming that, traditionally, visual harmony could be achieved by a certain play of tectonic layers and ornaments. The question is, what kind of patterns do human eyes prefer? As I was suggesting before, nature's fractal order as a complex symmetry may show similarities with the architectonic composition rules. That is, plants or natural textures can be essentially similar to the forms of architecture, not just on the structural and the urban scale, but on the level of ornaments and building materials as well. Maybe there is a common denominator, beyond calling them fractals, that can objectify this liaison between the natural and the artificial. In fact, there is one, and it is called the Hausdorff dimension in mathematics, that was introduced in 1918 by mathematician Felix Hausdorff. It suggests that all fractals have a uniquely calculated dimension, which does not necessarily need to be an integer, that describes the character of that fractal by a linear number. It also implies that if this is true, natural scenes, material textures, in architecture or urban facades can be compared based on this simple value. By making this comparison, one could tell if a building is mathematically entangled with the local nature, the urban area, or whether the materials are used in a way that the edifice suits its environment. In other words, genius loci, the spirit of place, may be described objectively in this way. I call this the relief method, which is one of the many Gestalt analyses that were recently enhanced by the fractal theory. The calculations are made according to certain logarithmic formulas, similar to this one. On the left side of the equation, letter D represents the Hausdorff dimension. Meanwhile, on the right, A stands for the total surface of the planar pattern. P is the pattern's perimeter. D represents the pattern's depth, while V is the surface of planar void summed up, and N is the indicator of the layer. From this formula, fascinating values derive. If we make a little effort to analyze the geometry of the facades of well-known historical monuments. It turns out that the Hausdorff dimensions of these elevations create a tendency, which illustrate the changes in the level of tectonic plasticity and ornamentation over time. We can see in the last column of this table that, for instance, Baroque architecture significantly increased its characteristic fractal dimension, while the modern epoch made the same variable fall below 2. This does not draw too far from our expectations, though, but we could not really formulate them before. We can also take samples from certain buildings, materials, and natural scenes by comparing their visual image with their actual material texture. This can either be done by measurements or scanning, and I choose the former method here. The funny thing is that the more archaic the material, the greater the plasticity, and that both modern buildings and the materials preferred by modernism produce minimal values of dimension. This slide shows a contrast between the less-than-planar modern Seagram building in New York City and the almost organic Virupaksha temple in Hampi, India, from the 14th century. I think it's quite obvious, and everyone can feel the difference between these buildings. Now we have a mathematical method to objectify this. We can also feel that something is more attractive in the picture on the right side, or we just increase our visual attention when looking at it relative to the other one. I suggest that visual attention, or simply put, visual harmony, may be encrypted in the numbers I have just shown to you. Hypothetically, fractal dimensions can affect the desirability of an urban area. That is, the likelihood of people walking by or spending more time at the shops, restaurants, and monuments of the pedestrian street. This is, for instance, Aberdeen in Scotland, the city that went through a major crisis during and after the COVID pandemic that left its high streets empty and its businesses ruined. It has been learned, though, that this process started years before, with the loss of interest in living in a so-called boring town. This British city is not the only one suffering from public indifference, the reasons for which could be the poor Gestalt quality of the urban areas, meaning the low level of plasticity, visual attraction, cultural interaction, and social facilities available for the locals. The Robert Gordon University, a private institute in Aberdeen, managed to study the problem and fostered plans how to enhance urban life and imagine a better future for British towns. Among others, they carried out the Livable High Street project for Union Street in the school by involving and interviewing pedestrians how they imagine better high streets. The answer was, of course, the recomposition of the urban facade, enhancing it with colors and forms, and using the street as a community space with small gestures of interaction and variety. This all led to a higher level of complexity by either furniture or interactive installations. In other words, the town's monumental and grey walls and the street had to be transformed into a living organism that resonates to complex fractal symmetries. The rethinking process began with urban patterns that were considered long forgotten or surmounted in scale. But in fact, this is the human scale that should never be forgotten. The fractal nature of forms is nothing else but the connectivity between different scales of shapes that translate the monumental into the humane, and vice versa. The simplest way to do it may be the reenactment of green district and park policies. But that could only work efficiently if the built environment also changes in a complex manner. Fractal analysis is potentially a great tool to reach this goal. What this could result in are the following: conscious planning to stop public disinterest and alienation, grasping the culture character of the place for contextual development. Strategic policies based on the impact of visual complexity, and a tool to understand, protect, and reuse our cultural heritage. These are all parts of a sustainable future. There are, of course, many other possibilities implied in this method that have to be carefully studied. I need to mention here the possibilities that, for instance, Springer's Nexus Network Journal offered to us as guest editors. In general, this journal is focused on the connection between architecture and mathematics. I believe that this connection is getting stronger each day since, through design, we can face social problems not just arbitrarily, but objectively and consciously. If you are more deeply interested in this subject, please visit my site below and see my relevant publications. Also, don't hesitate to contact me through this address. We may create together a better environment for the generations to come. Thank you for your attention.